All right, let's get
Yes.
started. So first of all, thanks again for the kind introduction and for having me back in Lancaster. Even if virtually, I wish I could join in person, but believe it or not, I'm actually in the middle of a move. And you sometimes regret promising an invited talk if you're just, packing your laptop and things like that. And you have to find your papers to prepare the talk and things like that. But I'm also happy because I'm actually a former student at Lancaster. Paul was one of my teachers when I was visiting for a year at Boland College as an undergraduate in 94, 95. So fantastic to be back. It's only my second time back since then. So my talk is entitled Financial Narratives, Information Asymmetry, and the Hunt for Alpha. And what this all is about is essentially greed, right? So there are plenty of people who want to extract money by various activities of investment and trading. And today we're going to look into some of these things and what they might have to do with things like NLP and machine learning. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, Jochen. I should say that I've gave you control, so you should be able to like go left and right. If it doesn't work, I'll do it.
Good question. How to turn here?
Yeah, I'll just do it. Yeah, I'll do that. It's fine.
Thank you so much. So here's a brief outline. So first I'll introduce things and we'll go pretty straight into the three topics of financial narratives, information asymmetry, and the hunt for alpha. And before I conclude, I will actually give you applications from NLP for different document types. Next slide, please. So, well, what is a financial narrative? What is a narrative anyway? It's a rhetorical device, right? We actually live and thrive on narrative as human beings. People are all about stories. Breaking the news is supposed to be objective, but people really only understand the unfolding of events if the narrative is captivating, if there is more than just a sequence of facts, if there is the red thread that links it all together so that we can remember, right? And how does that connect with financial markets, you might say? Take these two stories. The first one, US judge blocks New York vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. A short headline or medium-sized headline and a relatively short Reuters news message taken from yesterday. So obviously there are financial interests connected to any event, almost any event, and the same is true here. So vaccination is a public health topic. So this is not primarily financial news. However, because pharma companies produce vaccines and therefore benefit from pandemics financially, in the sense that they can sell more vaccines if there's more demand because there's more people worried about getting sick and they rightly seek to protect themselves. It is likely that an event announcing vaccine mandates may increase the share price of a pharma company, and a judge blocking such a thing may actually do the opposite. So at the bottom, there's the sort of the mechanics behind what this story might do to the share market. More vaccination, vaccine provider shares up, judge blocks the whole thing, vaccine providers down. And this is a narrative, so this unfolds over time. So this is not necessarily a one-stop type of activity or single point event. This may unfold as a fight between rival parties over several weeks or even months or years. And people may even forget about this and they may say, what was that? I don't remember this story at all, when they kind of join again after a few years in the middle of it. So at the bottom, you see the Pfizer share price dropping yesterday. And it is very tempting, and it often gets done, that people say, oh, that's because this story, right? However, there are some issues with that, and we'll get to that shortly. The second story on the right says governments to step in. A relentless rally in Europe's energy prices is piling up pressure on governments, with Spain and Greece taking steps to cushion the blow and so on and so forth. So here, this is more a report of prices already going up. So you could say this is a secondary story. It's a story about another story. And that in itself, if the energy goes up, likely the energy goes up even further after this story, because there is a loop back effect that people read this and they may say, oh, if energy goes up, I will invest in energy now. I will join this, I'll hop on the bandwagon, and I'll also make a profit on the back of the people who already initiated this or foresaw that. As long as you're not on the top of the spike, you can still benefit from this kind of news and profit. And of course, if a government takes counteraction and blocks this, they may succeed, then the prices drop. Then they may have limited success in their blocking activities, because we know it's difficult to coordinate such things across countries. It takes time and compromise. So maybe if the success of the government's activity is limited, the prices may go up even more. So two indicators for up and up respectively, and this below this is the price of liquid natural gas, which is commonly abbreviated LNG. Some of you may be familiar. Next slide, please. So it's pretty straightforward concept, financial narratives, linking the numeric development of some instrument to a story behind it that may be responsible, even causing it. But there are some issues. So first of all, the stories about the changes in the market themselves influences the markets. So the same, by the way, happens in election reporting too, and is a problem particular in the US, where it's constantly reported like who is the runner-up and who is sort of beating whom. And apparently a lot of Americans, so I am told, are influenced by that because they don't want to vote for a losing party. So rather than voting for what you're convinced, is the best choice, people like to vote on a winner, a certain fraction of the constituency anyhow. So these are the sort of secondary effects or feedback loops that make financial markets very complex. They are indeed complex, chaotic systems. There are often conflicting explanations also given for the same market moves. It's hard to tease out the true reason why, for example, the Pfizer share price on the previous slide actually dropped. So the story that we saw may account for some of that, but we don't actually know for how much of it, because there are plenty of other stories and there are many events that go unreported. A lot of share price movement is due to insider knowledge and consequently insider trading. And governments try to avoid that, but it is probably not possible to completely get rid of it. And this links us back to the topic of this talk, information asymmetry. So some people knowing more than other people and then exploiting that knowledge to the disadvantage of the rest. So it's hard to tease out the true reason, but also causes are given only after the fact, right? It's very easy to make up any explanation for a drop or a spike, but it's much harder to predict beforehand, will it go up or will it go down for any particular instrument? So if it's so easy to create an explanation after the fact, and if people are so smart about explaining everything away, and oh, I know it all, that was obvious, I often hear, but the same people don't make the prediction before things happen, right? So if you really understand the world so well, you should be making lots of money by being able to predict these things before they happen, and expect things naturally to unfold. And of course, there's only one version of the market. So it's like when you study history, there's only one course of things that humans go through as people, and there's no second control group that we can use to experiment with. And the same with financial markets. We can't just chop off, half of the market and run a parallel universe experiment to really learn the scientific way. We have to work with the given, and it's basically observational learning. And finally, news can be slightly biased. I'm getting more and more interested in that topic. So slightly biased, over manipulated substantially to even being complete fake. One example is if you consider interviews, who actually gets interviewed? Do they or their clients have a financial interest in the questions discussed? On blogs, people are forced to disclose potential conflicts of interest. But in a short interview, it's sometimes not clear if that question was asked before and cut out, or whether there might be something. And often it's indirect connections, through spouses and other relatives. People may hide their true financial interest. So there's a lot of that happening, and people are, like in the influencer space, trying to steer things in a particular direction, whilst trying very hard not to make this a transparent activity, of course, because then it wouldn't work. Next slide, please. So information asymmetry. In an ideal world, in a world where everybody would know everything just the same way, it would be very difficult for traders to profit, because there would be nobody that could have an information advantage, any asymmetry that could be exploited. All market information would be known to all actors at the same time, so a perfectly symmetric, an equilibrium in the information sphere, as economists would call that, and then all would then trade the same trades at the same time as a logical conclusion of the available knowledge, and nobody could really benefit, because somebody's gain is somebody else's loss. So in the markets, you can take stuff away from others, but you can't generate new wealth out of nothing. That doesn't exist. So you really can kind of only obtain something that was previously owned by somebody else who made a trading mistake, and that's your gain. In reality, though, some people do have knowledge advantages. So closer to important events, they know what will happen earlier than others. That's insider knowledge, and that exists to various degrees. There's actual insider trading, within the scope of a criminal offense in many countries, probably most. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure, but definitely all countries where I've ever looked, there's insider trading rules, and there's crimes that try to avoid this kind of activity. But at the same time, it's a gradient, it's a continuum, so it's very hard to get rid of it entirely. And if you hang around in New York or in London in the right bars, you may even accidentally overhear people talking about work all the time, and you may pick up some important piece of knowledge, and you may go back to your workplace and just trigger a trade based on what you've heard, what people are working on, or what kind of, maybe they're acquiring a company and they've discussed it over lunch, although they shouldn't. So because of the frail human nature, people may ignore instructions, not to take any work item outside. For example, in the UK, it is not uncommon to talk about business in a pub. And this can be exploited by counterparties. So it's very important to take this all very seriously. And that's no doubt responsible for part of this asymmetry that we see in the markets. And even if public knowledge, which is by definition accessible, gets used or is out there, not everybody may act on every bit of it. So a lot of people say, oh, that's public knowledge, therefore I cannot benefit from it. Here I would say that sounds likely true. It sounds convincing at first hand, but on the other hand, there is quite a lot of data out there, and sometimes in combination, if you have the right research hypothesis or investment hypothesis, how to use that data, you may actually make a profit, maybe not in high frequency trading, but using a longer term trading strategy based on big open data that is entirely public, that just doesn't get used or not yet used by all the hedge funds out there that kind of compete with you if you're in trading. Next slide, please. So over time, naturally, these information asymmetries balance out, right? information leaks, gossip gets spread on, and then the asymmetry is no longer there, and therefore the ability to profit disappears from a particular item of information. And the hunt for alpha, this metaphorical signal that is basically stands for the advantage over the competition, is the quest for that information advantage and its exploitation in financial trading. What do we need to do that? What does this game involve? Well, first of all, we need faster computers and more efficient code. So people working in at least the high frequency nature of the game, they have extremely fast machines. They put their servers close to the marketplace. They even write their own network stack. So they would take an open source operating system, they would rip out the network code and replace it by a version that doesn't do any error checks to save, nanoseconds, because you're really competing with the speed of light. You want the shortest possible cables so that you don't waste time by information packets, traveling another centimeter unnecessarily, and your competitor might have the shorter cable. So it's that kind of cruel competition in the high frequency space. There's a constant quest for new data sets that others might not yet have. So once you've cut your cables to the shortest possible amount, there's nothing more than you can optimize. Then you need to optimize in different directions. So there are people out there that constantly scavenge on behalf of hedge funds for data sets that are attractive and new and that competitors might not yet exploit. For example, around 2009, people came up with the idea of using satellite images to analyze the utilization rates of supermarket car parking lots, right? In other words, give me a satellite picture of Walmart and I'll count for you what's the percentage of car parking spots that are occupied. The idea behind that, it's hypothesis driven, was that an analyst at a Swiss bank thought, okay, if the car park is more busy, then people must be buying more. The reason for that must be the consumer sentiment must be very positive in that particular day or month. And they wanted to know if that gives them so-called alpha signal, competitive advantage brought to you by the information symmetry of you having that information and everybody else either not having it or not using it for that particular purpose. And it worked. It actually turns out that, at the time you could gain a 15% increase of some alpha signal over other people, which is enormous in an area where people are quite happy for 0.5%. So that's the hunt for alpha, the constant quest for new data, faster machines, shorter cables, and finally also talent. So there was a time when hedge funds cobbled up all the graduating PhD students in mathematics, physics, computer science, and so on. And they basically would just disappear and leave no trace, no more publications out there. And the reason for that is they were put in rooms, in groups, not allowed to talk to each other, tasked with the mission of creating original, creative trading strategies, not as a single activity, but as an ongoing stream of, like mining for alpha. So each time an idea gets tried out, maybe it works, maybe not. Maybe out of 10 ideas, one only works, and then you use it for 3 months, and by that time the other hedge funds had the same idea, and then the symmetry of the market is sort of back in a weak form. I'm making a weak statement here. This is not strong mathematical claims in any way, and then you need a new idea to move on to make profits, and all these ideas are then combined. And often the idea alone is not going to give you a real advantage because its effect may be quite small, but you take several such groups and you combine the various signals, and collectively you are able to make decisions using machine learning that help and that are better than your competitors' decisions. And this is how, for example, the Medallion hedge fund on Rhode Island created a lot of wealth for people like Rob Mercer, holder of the ACL Lifetime Achievement Award, who some of you may know from his papers with co-workers at IBM on statistical machine translation. He suddenly disappeared from the publication sphere and dedicated his talent in machine learning to this kind of automated trading. Next slide, please. So some research questions. What sources of such alpha signals could still exist that have not been exploited yet? So this is not just a question interesting to traders. This is also a question potentially interesting to NLP researchers, because text contains abundant signals if you have creative ideas how to extract a signal from, the sequence of tokens as we see it. Specifically, what investment hypotheses exist that have not been discovered yet? And even more specifically, what information systems can we build that support an analyst, in ideating such ideas, coming up with these, brainstorming with colleagues? They may want to check, is this true for Apple? Is this also true for all the other IT companies? What's the scope, the power, the size of a new idea? Which means, the number of financial instruments for which it is true over a substantial point in time. There are many ideas that are maybe valid for a short time span, but that's problematic because you want something that actually lives for a longer while. Otherwise, you need to quickly have the next idea and you kind of just work yourself to death. So also implementing the idea takes maybe also several weeks or months before you can actually start harvesting the benefits of your work. And companies like the Bloombergs, the Refinitives, the Factivas, and so on, they create these terminals or software financial information systems that help you to screen the market for companies that fit certain properties. So you can slice and dice company data, news data in many shapes or forms to test your hypothesis, first manually with a few examples, and then eventually maybe with a script to kind of on the way to automating that. And I already said what data sources exist that have not been tapped into yet. And I think the satellite story is a very nice one. And there are many others data sets where people currently look at, okay, could this be used? Does this have any connection with financial markets? And I find that intellectually an attractive exercise. Let's say you look at a random data set and you say, what's the financial connection to this data set? If I know this, because I have this data set, what does it allow me to conclude that has a financial impact in one direction or the other? And then to validate this using so-called backtesting, which means using a historic time series. Many of you on the call will know this, but I explain it just for the ones that are kind of new to the field. Backtesting is the sort of the testing against the training data that it all works out, if that works, you can test it on unseen data, and then if that works, then you can go live and make some money from it. So the question boils down to what evidence can we extract from unstructured sources, how to do that, and as I said, the hedge funds are on it. High frequency trading uses, for example, news agency headlines. They typically analyze only the headlines for speed reasons. They don't even process the stories. And the reason is that the headlines are sold by news agency often before the story is even written. Why would they do that? Because their main customers are now the machines. Over 80% of all trades are now done by machines, and the machines don't need the stories. By the time the first letter of the story is typed, the shares may be already dumped. Because if you don't, your competitors do. So you have to be faster. So if you see something like the word bankruptcy or something, in connection with a ticker symbol, you probably quickly want to dump that, unless the sentence ends with avoided. but it's probably still a negative signal to read bankruptcy, and we'll get into more technical details in a minute. So the hedge funds, they play big, and they have the technical infrastructure, the pipes, the bandwidth, the talent, and the investment capital so that they can do this. And high frequency trading is only one aspect of that. So extremely fast, high volume trades triggered only by automatic decisions, no longer humans in the loops. But there are also traders, automatic slower strategies, let's say with a 3-month time horizon. And of course, manual traders still exist and they can still make a profit, but they are finding it harder now to compete with the machines because of the speed of things and also because of the volume of investment that is now handed over by us to the machines. Yeah, and the last one is also important. What is the true value of a signal given the existence of transaction costs? I had to put this as a scientist, who often reviews financial trading type papers where somebody says, oh, I found new alpha, look here. And then you look at it and, okay, yeah, there's a little gain, but in a real trade, there's always a transaction cost. So any true alpha that you think you found needs to still be alpha nature in the face of transaction costs that you always have to pay. So this means that if your alpha signal is very small, you may not be able to utilize it for yourself because you haven't got the capital volume so that you can make a large enough trade so that the transaction cost doesn't cancel out your profit. And this is actually something that almost never gets accounted for in publications, and that's very disappointing. If you read a paper that leaves out that and therefore makes it unrealistic, it often has to be rejected just because it's actually not a good enough alpha signal, so to speak. And it would be very easy to add a little simulation at the end, but a lot of authors drop that last bit that is so important because without it you would make a loss. Next slide, please. Yeah, and if we decide we want to participate in this game, then the question is, what kind of data are we looking at? And for completeness rather than for anything else, I've put here the structured case. So structured data, for example, instrument price, the cost of an equity share of, let's say, for Apple at time t. That's a number, actually a time series, so a number associated with a timestamp that has been used, by people who study time series. People with a physics background are obviously very good with that because they may have looked at, the weather or other physical phenomena before and modeled time series of other kinds. And also trading volume can be interesting. On the left-hand side at the bottom, you see the 2020 market crash. Yes, those of you who were too concerned about the lockdowns and everything, they may not have been watching the share markets, but there was quite a crash in 2020. I think it made it to the top 8 of all time even, but people didn't really talk about it in the same bad way as 2008. I remember when I lived in the US in 2008, this was the only topic everybody was talking about and the only topic in the newspapers and on TV. But here, the financial side of things was a bit overshadowed by obviously pandemic health concerns, and perhaps rightly so. Then on the right-hand side, you see a surge of trading volume that just seems to be going on. That's interesting. I just saw this actually yesterday. I wasn't aware of it. The most recent spike that you see on the right-hand side, 2021. I think the last line might actually be an artifact of the plot potentially, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. But it's still, there's an uptrend going on that you can see from 2020, and that's real because that's right in the middle here. And this structured information has been predominantly the source of traders and machine, so human traders and machine traders, so to speak, for many decades. And only recently have people gone more into unstructured data, and that's of course text to us as NLP people. And now we get to the part that you probably care about. Next slide, please. So what unstructured sources do exist are relevant in this sphere of investment management, of financial trading? Well, investors repeatedly rely on actually mostly three types, so supplemented by a few others, but three are the main ones. High quality agency news, and we talked about that already a little bit, and then something called SEC filings, which we're going to look into, and then financial earning calls, recordings, and transcripts. So these are events that companies regularly hold. And beside these big players, so to speak, there are also additional sources, for example, brokerage reports. So a broker is an intermediate where you can buy and sell shares, and they do things for you on your behalf, but they also want you to transact through them. So they want to entice you to buy something they think is attractive. So they do their own market research. So research as in market research, financial data research, rather than R&D type activities. So no claim to novelty here. They're just looking at the market and writing a report about what's happening, what can they recommend to you to buy, in brackets, and pocketing a percentage of that deal as their profit. So again, they have their own interest in it, but they're still useful, these reports, to look at. And then there's rating agencies. They give credit rating scores to companies and sometimes instruments that you can invest in. And there's of course social media. And for a while, it looked like everybody was going to use some part of Twitter to invest, and then that quickly went silent again. So there was obviously a problem. But what has remained is the three sources of agency news: SEC filings and financial earnings calls. So let's look into these three main types that everybody studies repeatedly over the years, every day, every quarter, every year, again and again. Next slide, please. So let's start with news. We all know news, so it seems the easiest to talk about. But news actually move financial markets. So if a story breaks about a scandal pertaining to a company, let's say some CEO was mismanaging or even criminal, doing bad things, then this may affect the share price of the associated company stock. That's pretty obvious. But also complete sectors may develop in a certain way. For example, this Reuters article here on the right-hand side says China's property investment rises. So if you are a property investor, you may respond to that by, you may want to piggyback on that, or you may take an alternative route specifically to avoid these rising prices because you think it's already too expensive for you to get in. How you respond to it, that's your personal choice based on your personal investment strategy. But certainly based on what you do as response to that piece of news that you consume, the market then changes. And this means effectively the story changes the market, and you're just the middle person, because you saw the news and you acted on it. So news move financial markets. Journalists get paid for writing market-moving news. So they get a bonus for something that actually changed the share price immediately after it gets published. A business driver for news agency activities is always the financial impact of a story. For example, Julius Reuter, the German founder of Reuters that went to London to start his news agency there, originally trained carrier pigeons to bridge the time and the space between Dublin and London, so that American news could get to London more quickly, because the ships were slow at the time and they had to stop in Dublin before they moved on to London, bringing the news of what happened recently in America. And by bridging the last bit using air traffic as a means of transportation, namely these trained carrier pigeons, he was able to deliver the news to London quicker than his competitors, and that gave him some edge. And the same edge was obtained by his clients, who were able to place certain trades, already taking into account the information, financially relevant information that his reports carried. Company news, economic news, but also product news, geopolitical news, they all inform and influence investors, and therefore, yeah, they all move markets. And it is indeed the case that already for a number of years now, a large part of, or a segment of the news stories, I should say, is created automatically, is based on automatically created stories that are derived from so-called alerts. So there may be a price move. The price move triggers an alert, a certain rule that says, you know, if something drops very quickly or very much, let's generate automatically a news story and put that on the wire. And as you can imagine, once that story is out, it triggers an even further, you know, speedier decline of what's already going on. So this is, again, the feedback effect that we mentioned at the beginning. And that's known as robo-journalism. And these stories that are automatically created are getting more and more sophisticated and less templatized. And there are papers about that in the NLP literature where you can see how this is done, actually. It's quite an interesting area. Next slide, please. So that's the news, the first of the 3 types of document that every investor craves and regularly consumes. The second one is SEC filings. That cryptic name refers to the Securities and Exchange Act. It's a law from the 1930s when people said, okay, there's too much insider trading going on. We need to create a level playing fields, especially for small investors that don't have this insider information. So we just force companies to publicly disclose certain things regularly so that everybody has access to this information for the purpose of fairness. And these SEC filings, as they are known, are forms, online available documents that every publicly traded US company has to file either at certain regular intervals or when special events happen. There's one that gets filed every year, which is known as the Form 10K. Remember that one, it's very important. If you will do research in finance, you should definitely look at that type. Then there's one that gets filed every quarter, which is obviously more timely, has more short-term timely updates that should be disclosed. And the third one is also quite vital. Whenever a special thing happens, whatever that might be, something that is considered materially impacting the future of the company, a so-called Form 8K needs to be filed. So you surely don't want to miss one of those if you see them popping up. And you can actually go to sec.gov, and after a few clicks, you arrive at the EDGAR information system, which is essentially a database of all these forms. They're in some pseudo HTML format known as the EDGAR format. So from an NLP perspective, they're not so nice to work with in terms of pre-processing. But once you're over the pre-processing nightmare, they're actually interesting because there's a large amount of them freely available, and they go back like decades, basically till 1934. And they're long, they're rather dry, but they are the primary reading joy of Warren Buffett, according to himself. So that's what he uses as his bedtime reading and reading during most of the day as well. So he doesn't believe in any particular, you know, mathematical model or outsourcing the thinking to the computer, but he does crave data, and he gets the data and the inspiration for his personal investment insights and investment hypotheses from reading these raw reports, where also things like the risks need to be disclosed, and we'll get to that. Next slide, please. So SEC filings.
So we've got less than 5 minutes, Jochen.
Yes, yes. So the role of financial earnings calls finally is financial earnings calls are documents that are quarterly held, where the CEO and the CFO give an overview over the development of the company. And this is held in a sort of dialogue form. It gets recorded and transcribed. Next slide. So that's the third important type. And people have now done information extraction for historical reasons. I would like to acknowledge the Lolita system, an early information extraction system for finance developed in the UK as a PhD thesis. And this can recognize a certain number of very important financial event types, specifically from news sources from various vendors. Next slide. And then there are more recent information extraction systems. For example, we presented one at KDD a couple of years ago, where colleagues of mine developed a system that extracts events from the news as well as from Twitter and attempts to reconcile the two. So basically resolve events across media types for the first time. And we did this for a number of disaster events, man-made and natural disasters. But of course, such a system could as well be trained for specific financial events. Disasters are also important for finance because of insurance payments that have to follow, and generally they stimulate through reconstruction the economy in the aftermath. Next slide, please. So information extraction is a natural thing to do, and I just want to do a quick shout out, not to speak too long about our own work on information extraction of risks. So I will not go into the details here, but I just want to point you to these papers by myself and Frank Schilder, and maybe the last one by Tim Nugent and myself from 2016, where we describe methods that we've been pursuing for a while now to automatically learn taxonomies of risk types from the web, and then applying these taxonomies on news text in order to extract company risk relationships. So something like BP is exposed to oil spill risk and things like that. And this has been quite a fruitful development, and it has also been successfully used in production since about October 2018. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what this kind of method produces is tuples that basically say credit is a financial risk. So from these tuples, you can combine them, then you form a taxonomy, and then you look up these learned terms from the web up in running news text, and that unfortunately creates a lot of false positives because a word like fine is highly ambiguous. But then we used a supervised machine learning model based on support vector machines to disambiguate, and that avoided many of the false positives. So it was able to distinguish cases like Microsoft is facing a fine versus I feel fine, said Bill Gates. So obviously you need a bit of syntax for that. So we used a dependency parser as well as machine learning for that. And that is quite important because otherwise the false positives abound. Next slide, please. So these were two examples from information extraction. There's also work by Keegan and co-workers from 2009 at CMU, where basically a direct regression was trained on the risk section, the section 6 of SEC filings, which contains mandatory disclosure of material risks for companies. And this is quite interesting. Here's a number of words given below where you can see, what kind of words are correlated with risk. Obviously, loss, expenses, going concern, administrative in the sense of, going into administration, which means, just before going bust, you have to install an administrator, and there are some of these words that you can kind of learn that way. So this is another way of learning a vocabulary of risks, which is complementary, similar but different from the method that we have presented. This utilizes the numeric data as well as the text from the SEC filings. Next slide. So for the last bit of information for the earnings call transcript, there's also a fantastic work by Keith and Stent from 2019, where basically the transcripts of the financial earnings calls where people discuss how good was the quarter for the company and what are the current challenges, in brackets problems. They were analyzed and they were enriched by various mostly lexicon-based and n-gram-based features. And it was actually possible to use the earnings calls in this enriched form as predictors for analyst decisions. Yeah, if they change their mind about whether a company should be, recommended, or whether they wanted to distance themselves from that company in terms of investment. Next slide. So because of time, I cannot really talk you through the actual algorithms for these, but I hope you can see some of the interesting works here and maybe go to the original papers and read up on them. I've selected a few that I personally like, but it's a small and personal selection. There's obviously a lot more, and in the short time available, I cannot give you a full survey. Very recently, Savni, Agrawal, and Shah have actually shown a multimodal analysis of earnings call. I like this a lot because they basically train a neural network, a bidirectional LSTM, to make predictions about volatility. And the nice thing about this is they use not just the text, they use the text and the audio signal. So they look at, how nervous is the CEO when they talk and so on. And that's quite fascinating. That's something I've always wanted to do as well, and never really got to it. So glad people are picking up these cool ideas. Next slide, please. So that's something you can do with earnings calls. And we are at the end of the presentation. So I've given you a bit of a sort of intro into trading. What are the key factors, knowing something that others don't and exploiting it, in short, the alpha signal and relying on information asymmetry. And because you need to have an information advantage, it's a nice field for NLP. If you can be fast with your NLP, if you have fast machines and fast methods. And natural language processing can be used in two ways, either to assist the human when they create the ideas to invest. So that's the hypothesis finding process, or hypothesis testing. Before you code it up, you want to test it in some manual examples, or then using NLP in the trading itself. To conclude, I think the role of fresh data, human domain knowledge, and low latency processing are all pivotal in this game if you want to really profit and try your stuff out there in the wild. And future work may use arrays of mathematical acceleration hardware, as we already see, for other purposes in deep learning. I'm sure this hardware that everybody is getting will be that is already used for that as well. And more real-time data will soon become readily available in all parts because of IoT, Internet of Things, and open data initiatives. And on the algorithmic side, representation learning will become more important. This is not a hard prediction to make because, if you look at the trajectory from HPSG rules over SVMs, where humans had to write their own features, to the latest, self-trained neural models like BERT, where you basically throw everything in and do nothing at all, and you get very good results. That's kind of
sorry, Jochen, to interrupt. I think we're running out of time. But
yes, so that's the end anyhow. Thank you. So if we have questions, happy to answer.
Thanks a lot. That's really exciting, actually, to know about all these data sources and the hunt for alpha signal in them. It's quite exciting how much data is out there to be exploited. We still have a bit of time for questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to add it in the chat and I'll read it, or raise your hand and then we can unmute you to speak your question. Please go ahead. I mean, while they do, Jochen, I've got a question, and I wonder if it has ever been studied to know which of these data sources actually has an effect, because we see like data produced by companies, then regulated by governments, then we've got news agencies writing, and then we've got people actually talking online. So was it ever been studied to know which of those have an effect actually on the market, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that get studied all the time, they all three have substantial effects, right? But then a lot of them, a lot of smaller things have an impact, and that's on top. And the real surprise back in 2009 was the amount that the satellite image thing helped, yeah. but then it's only specific to maybe supermarkets. So there will be companies for which, you know, the parking lot doesn't help you. For example, a chip company, right? If the parking lot is full, it just means they're all at work. But this cannot be reinterpreted as customer sentiment. So this works only for supermarkets. So it's kind of a neat idea, but quite narrow. And it was interesting at the time how much that one helped, because we all need to eat, right? So it does have quite reach, nevertheless. And news definitely help. And it's important that we keep, you know, having news around for finance as well as for society. So I'm a strong proponent of news, and it's difficult because news don't sell well anymore. A lot of people think the news are found on the web. No, the news are written by real people that get shot at in Iraq. And you know, when I worked at Reuters, we had emails going around that somebody was injured or killed. There is a book in London that has all the names of the journalists that gave their life for, you know, reporting news from dangerous places. And this is not something that just appears on the web free of charge. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep this valuable information source active and don't lose it to people who automatically create some, you know, spam text that would not have the value that you're talking about. And then, yeah, the earnings calls are very important because people want to read the nuances of what the CEOs and CFOs say. And this is maybe a little bit like reading your coffee, and sometimes a little bit too much gets interpreted into it. But the markets are also opinion-based, right? This is not driven as a scientific venture. This is people's belief, and they have the right to act on their personal intuition. And the intuition can often be wrong, but then the move they make, that's objective, and that influences others.
That's actually quite, I mean, in addition to that, we got, I think, a question in the chat in relation to that is from Dominic. So Dominic says, why do you think Twitter is not fit for financial data analysis?
Yeah, so I have a personal hypothesis. I do not know if it's the truth, but I suspect that the people who have an information advantage have no interest in posting it publicly. They have a financial interest in exploiting it for themselves, right? So if after that it becomes public, they will be fine. But first, you know, they probably try to make a trade that they benefit from that information, whereas they have no benefit if they make it public, unless they are very unselfish. And a lot of people work in finance, you know, motivated by financial gain rather than by disclosing things that are interesting to people they don't know. Because yeah, so that's my personal. And the other thing is the people that are there, a lot of them may not have much to say about things that matter to finance, right? They may be consumers. But what you can take from Twitter, I don't think Twitter is not useful. I think, for example, swings in the mood about a brand, that could have value, right? So let's say at the moment, everybody is all the rave about Apple devices, and it's been like that for a while, but there was the time when they had the bad keyboards. And, you know, if this gets multiplied by the voice of Twitter, right, as an amplifier, then this could harm a company. This could have turned really badly. It didn't, but I think that could be just, you know, maybe we were just before it. If the keyboard had been a little bit worse and people had shouted a little bit louder, then maybe a lot of people would have stopped buying. And but they fixed the keyboards and they were able to turn it around quickly enough.
Yeah, that's quite true. So I mean, that's actually interesting for the data that is available. So I can see a question by Paul says, I mean, what about information that cannot be reached by NLP? So for example, you mentioned discussions in pubs or private conversation. So these are kind of data that we think are valuable but not reachable.
Yeah. So there is private data, and then if you can get hold of it, so you may buy it, right? Somebody may say, yeah, I'm selling you what people are telling in the pub. You know, they may need to put up a sign, we make the beer cheaper, but you will be recorded, and this will be sold, and people will say, oh, if the beer is cheaper, I'm fine with that. You can do anything if the beer is cheaper. I know people like that. So it may happen that so-called private data, you know, passes ownership even companies that, you know, produce data and for internal purposes, they may get acquired by a hedge fund if they are deemed interesting because they have deep pockets. So private is a time-dependent thing. Yeah, information ultimately may become free, may be leaked, and before that it may change hands. So I think this is a very good question, and a lot of it is this kind of, okay, it's not public information, it's not information that doesn't exist, it sits in a pocket, right? That's when it's really valuable, and that's when people may even compete for it, and that may drive up the price. And in fact, I could see a world where people create businesses where they create exactly data sets that nobody else has ad hoc, you know, based on thinking that is similar to the thinking of the teams in hedge funds, but more on the provider side.
Thanks for that. I mean, we're running out of time, but actually I found this very interesting. So we're still on coffee break, so people want to grab a drink or use the link to go into Gathertown and chat to each other's. Please feel free to. But if you don't mind, Jochen, there are 2 more questions, and then we can stop that. So Natalia asks, she asks, how crucial is the processing time for NLP aspects and of the narrative? So for example, she takes summarization, it might take minutes, might take hours. And how do you say that is, or how it should be used in trading because of that, like time constraints, for example?
Very good question. So the people that are doing high frequency trading, they either don't use NLP or they use very simple NLP, as far as I know. This is similar to people in computer security who read your emails. Yeah, they use a little hardware device, and this implements a finite state transducer. And if you use certain keywords in your email, somebody will be alerted and will look at that email. There isn't any sophisticated, you know, meaning analysis with lambda discourse representation structures or HPSG features or whatever. It's very basic. You could call it string processing that might be linguistically motivated. But that's for the high speed stuff, right? As I said, not everything is high frequency trading and super time critical. It actually depends a lot on your trading strategy. There are a number of people who trade with a 3-month horizon. And then if you run something that runs for the whole day, it's fine, because you buy something, you keep it for 3 months, and then you sell, right? So that's a bit of a more relaxed trading regime.
Thanks a lot, Jochen. So here's one kind of like open-ended question, but actually I found it very interesting. So Mohammed asks, what if the information amplified by Twitter is fake? I mean, is there any way to counter that in the analysis? I think it is a challenging question, but I would like to hear.
So that's the question where we don't have the answer yet, right? So fake news, media bias, these are all research topics. And not only that, in addition to, you know, finding scientific answers about, you know, what technical help can we provide, we need to be able to install the solutions that we may find in the future in society. And they actually need to be operated in a way that is profitable or gets paid for in some way. Otherwise, it will not be done. So I think it's a 2-part answer. It's not just, you know, yeah, we need to do research on this and find out, can we detect it? Can we automatically sort of route it to humans for review if the machine has evidence that it might be fake or manipulated? Actually, you could say a lot of news is manipulated because there's often a political agenda which people are, if they're educated, aware of, right? That a certain party, close to a party, maybe more conservative or more liberal type paper, often people buy both to have a more comprehensive view. And on the internet, it's a bit more chaotic and subtle because you get flooded from all kinds of, and you often don't know who even owns it. So that makes it all more complicated. Plus, there's not just the political bias, there is now geopolitical manipulation going on with, you know, state actors wanting to destroy the Western world or create division in society, get rid of democracies and so on through disinformation campaigns. And this is essentially a new form of war. So that's kind of a quite an off-topic answer to a question that is also quite big, going beyond the topic of Paul, I guess.
I mean, we can end with last question from Dominic again, but I like this because it is more into like production rather than just research. So question says on implementation. So what she asked is, in production, what would be approximately the size of team needed to implement such research? And then she's citing your work on risk extraction from news.
So this does not require a very large team to build, to develop, but to operate. The size of any operations team is obviously dependent on what you want to apply it to. I find this is actually quite a generic technique that you can deploy in different areas of risk, and depending on what you do with it, right, you may need either a handful of people or thousands of people. So this is, I cannot give you any numbers of how many people we had to work on this. That's confidential, but as you can imagine, if something finds out risks, then everywhere where you need to know what are the risks of associated with, say, a company or even a person, where that is valuable, you could implement that. I don't think it's a very resource intensive thing to do research on, but deployment varies based on the scale of the data, as usual.
Thanks a lot. Again, thanks a lot for your time, for the exciting presentation, and for answering all our questions. I hope everyone can join me, applause online, but thanks a lot from here, at least from us. And so what we'll do now is we're going to stop for whatever left of the coffee break. And we'll see you at 11:10 with a presentation by Professor Antonio Moreno. And thanks again, Jochen, and see you soon.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward for the remainder of the workshop. Thank you, Mo.
Anytime. Cheers.